The Battle of Saratoga, comprising two significant engagements on September 19th and October 7th, 1777, marked a pivotal turning point in the American Revolutionary War. This American victory not only bolstered patriot morale, but also secured crucial international support, notably from France. Hi there, I'm Kyle, the host of History of Human Evolution. With a PhD in history and a love for storytelling, I'm here to guide you through the fascinating journey of our species. If you like to explore the past, hit that subscribe button, like this video, and share your thoughts below. The year is 1777. The British Empire, confident in its military prowess, devises a grand strategy to crush the rebellion that has been simmering for 2 years in its American colonies. The goal is clear: sever New England, the heart of the Revolution, from the rest of the colonies by seizing control of the Hudson River Valley. This would effectively cut the rebellion in two, isolating its most radical elements and restoring royal authority through a swift, decisive campaign. General John Burgoyne, a seasoned officer and playwright, is entrusted with leading this effort. His plan is ambitious. He will march south from Canada with a force of about 7,000 men, a mix of British regulars, Hessian mercenaries, loyalists, and Native American allies. At the same time, Colonel Barry Street Ledger is to advance from the west, cutting through the Mohawk Valley, while General William Howe, commanding the main British Army in New York City, is expected to push northward up the Hudson. If all goes according to plan, the three forces will converge in Albany, crushing the Continental Army in a coordinated assault. But from the very beginning, the execution of this strategy is fraught with difficulties. The terrain of upstate New York is dense, rugged, and unforgiving, filled with thick forests and winding rivers that slow Burgoyne's progress. He has to build roads as he moves, hacking through the wilderness while dragging an enormous baggage train filled with artillery, supplies, and even luxuries befitting a European campaign. The journey is slow, exhausting his troops and depleting their provisions. Meanwhile, St. Ledger's advance is met with fierce resistance. His force is stopped at Fort Stanwix by a determined American defense, reinforced by local militias and Oneida warriors who refuse to align with the British. A relief column of American militiamen, many of them from the frontier, ambushes St. Ledger's native and loyalist allies at the Battle of Oriskany, dealing a devastating blow. With no reinforcements coming and his allies wavering, St. Ledger is forced to retreat, his contribution to the grand strategy collapsing entirely. But the most disastrous failure comes from Howe. Instead of marching north to support Burgoyne, Howe chooses to pursue personal glory by capturing Philadelphia, the revolutionary capital. He sails his army south, fights a series of battles in Pennsylvania, and ultimately occupies the city, but at the cost of abandoning Burgoyne to his fate. As Burgoyne continues south, the reality of his situation becomes painfully clear. He is alone. No reinforcements are coming. The American forces, under General Horatio Gates and bolstered by skilled frontiersmen led by Benedict Arnold and Daniel Morgan, grow stronger by the day. They harass his columns, ambush his foraging parties, and choke off his supply lines. The British, once so confident in their strategy, now find themselves surrounded, vulnerable, and running out of options. What was supposed to be a swift, crushing blow to the rebellion has become a desperate struggle for survival. The campaign that was meant to divide the revolution has instead set the stage for one of its most decisive moments. September 19th, 1777. The British advance through the dense forests of upstate New York, their formation moving cautiously as they close in on the American positions near the Hudson River. General John Burgoyne, still confident despite his dwindling supplies and the absence of reinforcements, orders his forces to press forward. His objective: to break through the American defenses and secure control of the high ground south of Saratoga. If successful, the path to Albany would be open. The British Army, nearly 7,000 strong, is divided into three columns. The left, under Brigadier General Simon Fraser, moves along a ridge to outflank the Americans. The center, commanded by Major General James Inglis Hamilton, takes the main road toward the enemy. Meanwhile, a third force, led by Baron Friedrich Riedesel and composed largely of Hessian troops, holds in reserve to provide support where needed. Burgoyne expects the Americans to stay entrenched behind their defenses, reacting to his advance rather than dictating the fight. But the American commander, General Horatio Gates, has no intention of waiting passively. His forces, numbering roughly 8,500, are positioned behind strong fortifications at Bemis Heights. Yet, it is not Gates who makes the first move. Instead, it is his aggressive subordinate, Benedict Arnold, who understands that allowing the British to dictate the terms of battle would be a grave mistake. Arnold urges Gates to authorize an attack before Burgoyne's forces can fully deploy. Reluctantly, Gates agrees. He dispatches a contingent of sharpshooters and light infantry under Colonel Daniel Morgan, a veteran of frontier warfare, to harass the British advance. Morgan's men, skilled marksmen armed with long rifles, move swiftly through the trees, using the terrain to their advantage. As Hamilton's column crosses a clearing near Freeman's Farm, a small but strategically located stretch of land, the first shots ring out. The British, caught in the open, are thrown into momentary confusion as American riflemen pick off officers and key personnel with deadly precision. Fraser's column, attempting to maneuver around the American flank, moves to reinforce Hamilton's beleaguered troops. The battle intensifies as more British soldiers pour into the fight. Unlike traditional European engagements fought in open fields, Freeman's Farm devolves into a brutal, close-quarters struggle in the thick woods. Smoke fills the air, musket fire echoes through the trees, and soldiers on both sides engage in desperate hand-to-hand combat. Despite the Americans' initial success, the British, bolstered by reinforcements, begin to regain ground. Burgoyne, realizing the intensity of the resistance, commits Riedesel's Hessians to the fight. The disciplined German troops, marching in lockstep, press forward and unleash volleys of musket fire, forcing the Americans to pull back. As the sun begins to set, the battlefield remains contested, but the British hold the field. Yet, their victory is far from decisive. They have suffered heavy casualties, nearly 600 men lost. The Americans, despite withdrawing, have demonstrated that they will not be easily dislodged. More importantly, Burgoyne's fragile position has only worsened. His forces are bleeding strength, his supply lines remain vulnerable, and his enemy is growing bolder by the day. October 7, 1777. The British Army, weakened and running out of options, prepares for one final push. General John Burgoyne has waited for reinforcements that will never come. His supplies are dwindling, his troops are exhausted, and his once grand strategy is unraveling. Surrounded by an ever-growing American force, he makes a desperate decision. Launch a reconnaissance in force against the enemy's left flank, test their defenses, and, if possible, punch through. If the attack succeeds, the British might regain the initiative. If it fails, there may be no way out. Burgoyne assembles a strike force of around 1,500 men. At its core are the disciplined British regulars, supported by German mercenaries under Baron Riedesel and a contingent of loyalist and indigenous fighters. They advance in 3 columns toward Bemis Heights, where the Americans have entrenched themselves under General Horatio Gates. The terrain is challenging, wooded, uneven, and filled with enemy sharpshooters waiting in the shadows. The British move cautiously, but they do not go unnoticed. American scouts report the movement to Gates, who remains reserved, unwilling to commit his forces too quickly. But once again, Benedict Arnold, still officially sidelined after a heated argument with Gates, understands what must be done. His instincts tell him the British attack is vulnerable, uncoordinated, and stretched too thin. Ignoring orders, he rides onto the field, rallying troops to counter the assault. As the British push forward, they encounter stiff resistance from the American lines. Daniel Morgan's riflemen, positioned strategically in the trees, unleash devastating fire. Their long rifles, superior in range and accuracy, tear into the advancing British officers, creating chaos in the ranks. The British attempt to regroup, But the Americans, emboldened by their success, counterattack with ferocity. Arnold, now fully engaged in battle, leads the charge. He directs Colonel Ebenezer Learn's brigade against the German troops on the British right flank, shattering their formation. As the Hessians retreat, the center of Burgoyne's line begins to collapse. Arnold, refusing to relent, spots the British position at the fortified Brayman redoubt and surges forward. His men storm the defenses, musket balls whizzing past, bayonets clashing in brutal hand-to-hand combat. The redoubt falls, and with it, the last hope of a British breakthrough. Amid the chaos, Arnold is shot in the leg, ironically, by one of his own men in the confusion of battle. But the damage is already done. Burgoyne's forces, battered and disorganized, withdraw under the cover of night. The attack on Bemis Heights has failed, and with it, any realistic hope of British victory in the campaign. October 17, 1777. The British camp at Saratoga is silent. No more musket volleys, no more shouted orders. Only the rustling of wind through the trees and the occasional murmurs of weary soldiers. General John Burgoyne, once confident in his campaign to crush the rebellion, now sits at a table inside a tent, preparing to sign the document that will formalize his army's surrender. His dream of marching triumphantly into Albany has ended in humiliation. For weeks, the British had been trapped. After their disastrous defeat at Bemis Heights, Burgoyne's forces had attempted to retreat northward, but the Americans, anticipating every move, cut off every avenue of escape. Supplies were nearly exhausted, morale was disintegrating, and his army, reduced by casualties, illness, and desertion, was incapable of breaking through the enemy lines. The once proud force of nearly 7,000 men had been whittled down, surrounded, and left with no hope of reinforcement. Inside the American camp, General Horatio Gates knew that time was on his side. With each passing day, the British situation grew more desperate. He refused to waste men on unnecessary attacks, opting instead to tighten the noose. By mid-October, Burgoyne had no choice. His troops were starving. His officers were pleading for an end to the suffering, and there was no indication that relief would arrive. On October 13th, he called a council of war. The decision was unanimous. Negotiations must begin. Burgoyne first proposed lenient terms. He suggested that his troops be allowed to march back to Canada, still armed, under the condition that they would not fight again in the rebellion. Gates, understanding his superior position, rejected the proposal outright. The Americans dictated the terms. The British would surrender their weapons, and the entire army would be taken as prisoners of war. 4 days later, the formal surrender took place. Burgoyne, dressed in his finest uniform in a last attempt to maintain dignity, rode to the American camp. As he dismounted, he removed his ceremonial hat and presented his sword to Gates. The American general, in an act of calculated magnanimity, immediately returned it, a gesture that signified respect, but also underscored the reality of British defeat. One by one, the British troops marched through the American lines, stacking their muskets and equipment in organized piles. Many were sick, exhausted, or wounded. Some wept openly. The Hessians, unsure of their fate, stood in silent resignation. Burgoyne's officers, many of them veterans of the European wars, had never experienced anything like this. They were prisoners not of a disciplined imperial power, but of an upstart republic they had been assured would collapse under British pressure. News of the victory at Saratoga spread quickly. Throughout the American colonies, celebrations erupted. It was not just another battlefield success. It was proof that the Continental Army could defeat the British in a large-scale engagement. In Philadelphia, members of the Continental Congress toasted the triumph, recognizing that it could change the course of the war. But the most significant consequence was yet to unfold. In Paris, French diplomats had been closely watching the events in America. Up to this point, France had provided covert support to the revolutionaries, but they had hesitated to commit fully to the cause. Saratoga changed everything. The victory convinced King Louis XVI and his advisors that the American rebellion was not just a fleeting insurrection. It was a viable war effort that could deal a major blow to Britain's global dominance. Within months, France formally entered the war, signing treaties of alliance and military assistance with the United States. Soon after, Spain and the Dutch Republic followed. What had begun as a colonial rebellion had now escalated into an international conflict. For Burgoyne, the consequences were immediate and deeply personal. He was sent back to Britain in disgrace, where he faced public scorn and political condemnation. His military career was effectively over. For the British government, the surrender at Saratoga was a catastrophe. Their strategy of cutting off New England had failed spectacularly, and now they faced not just colonial militias, but the full might of European powers determined to see them weakened. As the British troops marched away under guard, many understood that they had not just lost a battle, they had lost the initiative. The war would drag on for several more years, but from this moment on, the British Empire would never again hold the upper hand in America. The reality of Saratoga is best understood through the words of those who stood in the thick of it. Officers, soldiers, and witnesses whose accounts preserve the tension, desperation, and brutality of the campaign. General John Burgoyne, writing to Lord George Germain, the British Secretary of State for the Colonies, attempted to justify the failure of his campaign. In his letter, he detailed the growing hardships that had pushed him to surrender. Supplies had run dangerously low, he explained, and his forces were outnumbered, encircled, and increasingly demoralized. He described the American forces as numerous and ardent, and though he tried to maintain the dignity of his position, the letter made it clear Saratoga had become a siege, and there was no hope of escape. Burgoyne had little choice but to negotiate. Among the British officers present at Saratoga, Major John Dyke Ackland left a striking testimony of the battle's human cost. Ackland, commanding a regiment of grenadiers, was severely wounded at Bemis Heights. Shot in both legs, he was carried off the field and taken prisoner by the Americans. Despite being an enemy officer, he later recalled being treated with unexpected kindness. Ackland's experience illustrated a stark contrast between the savagery of battle and the formalities of 18th-century warfare, where a captured officer might receive medical attention and humane treatment rather than brutal reprisal. On the American side, Colonel Daniel Morgan's riflemen played a decisive role, and first-hand accounts from those who served under him describe a battlefield unlike the rigid, structured European engagements. Morgan's men were frontiersmen, trained in irregular warfare. They fired from the cover of trees, targeting officers and gunners with deadly precision. One of Morgan's sharpshooters, Timothy Murphy, was credited with striking down British General Simon Fraser from a distance, an act that threw the British command structure into further disarray. Though some accounts of Murphy's role were likely embellished, the impact of American riflemen was undeniable, as British officers repeatedly noted the devastating accuracy of their fire. Private Samuel Woodruff, an American soldier who fought at Bemis Heights, later wrote of the battle's sheer ferocity. He described waves of British soldiers advancing through the gunpowder smoke, Hessian mercenaries clashing with American bayonets, and the relentless sound of cannon fire. But his most haunting recollection came after the battle, when the wounded lay scattered across the fields and forests. With British forces in retreat, many of their injured were left behind, some lingering for days without medical aid. Woodruff recalled seeing wounded men attempting to crawl toward water, only to collapse before reaching it, a grim testament to the suffering left in the wake of the fighting. Among the most revealing documents from Saratoga was the official record of surrender. When Burgoyne finally capitulated, he was required to sign the terms dictated by General Horatio Gates. The surrender document, written in formal diplomatic language, concealed the humiliation of the British defeat beneath phrases of military decorum. But accounts from those present at the surrender ceremony tell a different story. British soldiers, many of whom had fought with professional discipline only weeks before, now stood in broken lines, exhausted and bitter, forced to stack their weapons in front of their former enemies. For the Americans, the victory was not just strategic, but symbolic. One observer, a New England militiaman, described the moment Burgoyne handed his sword to Gates. A silence fell over both armies, he wrote, as if everyone present understood the magnitude of what had just occurred. It was a moment that signified not just the end of a battle, but a turning point in the war itself. Saratoga was not just another battle in the American Revolution. It was the moment when the war shifted irreversibly in favor of the Patriots. The British strategy of isolating New England had collapsed, and with it, the illusion that the rebellion could be swiftly crushed. The stunning American victory shattered British confidence and forced a reassessment of the entire war effort. The political consequences in London were immediate. Parliament erupted in debate. British leaders had assumed that a disciplined European army would easily suppress colonial resistance, but now that assumption lay in ruins. Even Prime Minister Lord North began to recognize that victory might not be inevitable. King George III, however, remained adamant. The rebellion had to be suppressed at any cost. The defeat at Saratoga hardened British resolve, but also exposed deep divisions. Some within the government, including members of Parliament sympathetic to the American cause, began advocating for peace negotiations. Others saw the war as an escalating disaster, a conflict that was now draining British resources and threatening the stability of the empire. But the most decisive impact of Saratoga was felt not in Britain, but in France. For years, the French government had been watching the rebellion with cautious interest. They despised Britain, eager for revenge after their losses in the 7 Years' War, but they hesitated to fully commit to a cause that might still fail. Saratoga changed that calculation. The victory demonstrated that the American forces were capable of defeating a professional British army in the field. Suddenly, backing the revolution was not just an act of defiance. It was a strategic opportunity. Within months, France formally entered the war. The Treaty of Alliance, signed in early 1778, transformed the American struggle from an isolated colonial rebellion into an international conflict. French money, troops, and naval power flooded into the war effort. Soon after, Spain and the Dutch Republic also joined the fight, forcing Britain to divert its military resources across multiple continents. With the entry of France, the nature of the war fundamentally changed. Before Saratoga, the British had been fighting a rebellion. After Saratoga, they were engaged in a full-scale global war. The Royal Navy, once unrivaled, now faced a combined Franco-Spanish fleet that threatened its dominance. British armies, once focused on North America, were now stretched across the Caribbean, the Mediterranean, and even India. The conflict had spiraled far beyond the original intent of suppressing colonial dissent. For the Americans, the victory at Saratoga reinforced a crucial reality. This war could be won. The Continental Army had proved itself against one of the most formidable military powers in the world. The psychological impact was enormous. American forces, often plagued by supply shortages, inconsistent enlistments, and political rivalries, now had tangible proof that their cause was not hopeless. The victory energized militias, boosted recruitment, and solidified support for the revolution in both Congress and among the general population. Even among Britain's loyalist allies, the surrender at Saratoga had devastating consequences. Many loyalists had supported the crown under the assumption that British victory was inevitable. But as news of Saratoga spread, the perception of British invincibility crumbled. Loyalist recruitment suffered, and some began to question whether they had chosen the wrong side. The significance of Saratoga was not just in the battle itself, but in what followed. From this point forward, the British war effort became increasingly defensive. The momentum had shifted. The rebellion, once dismissed as a disorganized insurrection, had now forced the most powerful empire in the world into a war it could no longer easily win. We'd love to hear your thoughts on possible future topics. What areas of human evolution would you like to explore next? Leave your suggestions in the comments, and let's keep the conversation going. As always, our references and further reading are listed in the description below if you'd like to dive deeper into the subject. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next episode.